Tom Bradley wiped down the bar counter for what felt like the 100th time that evening. The rain outside was coming down hard, drumming against the windows of his pub like tiny fingers tapping for attention. He'd been running the King's Head for almost 16 years now, and he could read the weather like a book. Rainy Thursday nights usually meant a quiet crowd, just the regulars nursing their pints and maybe a few folks ducking in from the storm. The pub wasn't much to look at from the outside. Just another corner establishment squeezed between a fish and chip shop and a dry cleaner on Maple Street. But inside, it had character. Dark wooden beams crossed the low ceiling, and the walls were covered with old photographs of the neighborhood from decades past. Tom had inherited the place from his uncle, and he'd worked hard to make it feel like home for everyone who walked through those doors. Tom prided himself on running a clean, respectable establishment. No trouble, no nonsense, just good drinks, and decent food. He'd seen plenty of pubs go downhill over the years, turning into rowdy places where families didn't feel safe. That wasn't going to happen to his place. Not on his watch. The dinner crowd had mostly cleared out by 8:30. Mrs. Peterson sat in her usual corner booth, working on a crossword puzzle while her shepherd's pie grew cold. 3 construction workers occupied the bar stools, still, in their work clothes, complaining about their foreman while downing their second round. A young couple shared a table by the window, more interested in each other than their fish and chips. Tom liked evenings like this. Peaceful, predictable. He could handle the glasses without rushing, maybe catch up on some paperwork, and close. Up at a reasonable hour. The rain seemed to be getting heavier, and he figured most people would stay home tonight rather than venture out. That's when the door opened with a sharp jingle of the bell. The man who walked in was impossible to ignore. He stood in the doorway for a moment, water dripping from his coat onto the worn carpet. But it wasn't his wet clothes that caught everyone's attention. It was what he was wearing underneath. A bright red military uniform that looked like something straight out of a royal ceremony. The jacket was perfectly tailored with shiny gold buttons running down the front and elaborate braiding on the shoulders. White gloves peeked out from his coat pockets, and under his arm, he carried what looked like a massive black fur hat. The pub went quiet. Even the construction workers stopped their conversation to stare. The young man looked around the room nervously, clearly aware that all eyes were on him. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, with tired eyes, and the kind of posture that comes from standing at attention for hours. Water still dripped from his dark hair as he made his way toward the bar. Tom's first thought was trouble. In his experience, people who showed up in costumes were usually looking for attention, free drinks, or both. He'd seen it all over the years. Folks dressed as superheroes on Halloween trying to get discounts, university students in silly outfits causing disruptions, and wannabe actors practicing their roles while disturbing other customers. The uniform looked expensive, he had to admit. The fabric seemed high quality and the details were impressive. But Tom had seen some pretty convincing costumes before. You could buy almost anything online these days, and some people went to great lengths for their pranks or parties. The young man approached the bar slowly, still dripping from the rain. Up close, Tom could see the exhaustion in his face. Dark, circles under his eyes, slight tremor in his hands. He looked like someone who'd had a very long day, but that didn't change the fact that he was wearing what appeared to be a military costume in Tom's pub. "Evening," the young man said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the low murmur of conversation that had resumed. "Could I get a pint, please?" "Anything on tap is fine." Tom crossed his arms and studied the stranger carefully. The uniform really did look authentic. The stitching was precise, the colors vibrant, and even the buttons seemed to be made of real brass, but appearances could be deceiving. "Having a costume party, are we?" Tom asked, his tone neutral but skeptical. The young man looked confused. "I'm sorry?" "The outfit," Tom gestured toward the red uniform. "Bit elaborate for a Thursday night, don't you think?" A flush of color rose in the young man's cheeks. "This isn't a costume. I'm with the Queen's Guard. I just finished my shift and—" "Right," Tom interrupted, his suspicion growing. He'd heard every excuse in the book over the years. "And I suppose you've been protecting the Queen all day, have you?" The stranger's jaw tightened slightly. Actually, yes. I've been on ceremonial duty for the past 12 hours. I know how this looks, but I assure you this uniform is genuine. Tom had to give the young man credit. He was sticking to his story. But the whole situation felt off. Real soldiers didn't just wander into neighborhood pubs in full-dress uniform, did they? Especially not uniforms that looked like they belonged in a museum or a tourist photograph. The construction workers had turned around on their stools to get a better look at the scene unfolding at the bar. Mrs. Peterson had looked up. From her crossword puzzle, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she watched with curious eyes. Even the young couple by the window had stopped gazing at each other to see what was happening. Tom felt the weight of their attention. This was his pub, his territory, and he needed to handle the situation properly. He'd built his reputation on maintaining order and keeping troublemakers out. If he let one person in a costume get away with causing a scene, word would spread. Before long, every attention seeker in the neighborhood would think the King's Head was an easy target. "Look, mate," Tom said, keeping his voice steady but firm. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm not buying it. Real soldiers don't walk around in fancy dress uniforms after hours. They change into normal clothes like everyone else." The young man's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or hurt. "I understand your skepticism, but I can show you my identification if anyone can get fake ID these days." Tom cut him off again. "Internet's full of companies that'll make you anything you want. Military cards, police badges, you name it." The pub had grown uncomfortably quiet again. Tom could feel everyone listening to every word, waiting to see how this would play out. He knew he had to take control of the situation before it got out of hand. The young man reached into his jacket pocket, presumably for his identification, but Tom held up a hand to stop him. "I don't want to see your props," Tom said, his voice getting firmer. "What I want is for you to take your costume party somewhere else. This is a respectable establishment, not a theater." The exhaustion in the stranger's eyes was replaced by something else now, a mixture of disbelief and growing frustration. His hands clenched slightly at his sides, and Tom could see that his patience was wearing thin. "Sir, I understand this is unusual, but I'm not causing any trouble. I just want a quiet drink after a very long day of service. If you'll just let me show you, I've made my decision," Tom announced loudly enough for the entire pub to hear. "We don't serve costume. Party's here. Find yourself another place to play dress up." The words hung in the air like smoke from an old cigarette. The young man stood there for a moment, seeming to process what had just happened. His face went through a series of emotions: shock, hurt, and finally a kind of resigned dignity that somehow made his fancy uniform look even more authentic. But Tom had already made up his mind, and he wasn't about to back down now. The young soldier stood there for what felt like forever, his wet uniform dripping onto Tom's freshly mopped floor. The silence in the pub was thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Tom could feel their eyes on him, and he knew he had to stand his ground. This was his place, and he wasn't going to let some costume-wearing troublemaker make him look weak. "Look, I don't want any problems," the young man said, his voice quieter now, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "I've been standing guard at Buckingham Palace since 6 this morning. It's been raining for hours, and I haven't sat down once. All I want is one drink, and then I'll be on my way." Tom felt a flicker of doubt. The way the stranger spoke, the weariness in his voice, it sounded genuine. But he'd been fooled before by good actors. Just last month, someone had tried to convince him they were a famous musician, complete with fake backstage passes and everything. Tom had almost fallen for it until he recognized the guy as a regular troublemaker from 3 streets over. "Buckingham Palace?" Tom repeated, letting skepticism drip from his voice. "Right. And I suppose the Queen personally thanked you for your service today, did she?" A few of the regulars chuckled at that, but the sound felt forced. The atmosphere in the pub had changed. What started as curious entertainment was becoming uncomfortable. Mrs. Peterson was fidgeting with her crossword puzzle, clearly not enjoying the confrontation. The young couple by the window had stopped eating entirely, their food growing cold as they watched the scene unfold. The soldier's face tightened. "No, sir. The Queen doesn't personally thank the guards. We do our duty whether anyone acknowledges it or not. That's what service means. There was something in the way he said it that made Tom pause. The words came out automatically, like they'd been drilled into him over years of training. But Tom had already committed to his position, and backing down now would make him look foolish in front of his customers. Service? Tom laughed, but it came out harsher than he intended. Mate, the only service you're doing is providing entertainment for my customers. Though I have to say, you're quite the actor. Almost had me believing you there for a second. The young man's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he kept them there. Tom noticed the restraint and filed it away. Most troublemakers would have lost their temper by now, maybe taken a swing or started shouting. This one seemed to be fighting to keep his composure. Sir, I can prove who I am, the soldier said, his voice getting stronger despite his obvious exhaustion. I have my military identification, my duty roster, even photos from today's ceremony. Please just give me a chance to show you. Photos? Tom scoffed. Anyone can take photos. Probably snapped them while you were playing tourist outside the palace gates. He was really warming up now, feeling more confident with each dismissal. I've seen your type before. Dress up in fancy costumes, make up elaborate stories, all to get free drinks or impress the ladies. The construction workers at the bar were starting to look uncomfortable. One of them, a middle-aged man with paint-stained fingers, caught Tom's eye and gave a small shake of his head. He seemed to be suggesting that maybe Tom should ease up a bit, but Tom was too far in to stop now. The young soldier reached into his jacket pocket, moving slowly and deliberately. Tom tensed, ready for trouble, but the man only pulled out a black leather wallet. His movements were precise, almost mechanical, like he'd done this same action thousands of times before. Here, the soldier said, opening the wallet and pulling out what looked like an official identification card. This is my military ID. It has my photo, my rank, my unit designation, everything. Please just look at it. Tom barely glanced at the card before waving it away. I told you anyone can fake those things. There are websites that'll make you any kind of fake ID you want for £20. Military, police, even government officials. Do you think I was born yesterday? The frustration in the young man's eyes was becoming more obvious now. His jaw was tight, and Tom could see a muscle twitching in his cheek. But instead of exploding like Tom expected, the soldier took a deep breath and tried a different approach. All right, forget the ID, he said, his voice still controlled but with an underlying tension. Ask me anything about the Queen's Guard. Test my knowledge. I can tell you about the ceremony rotations, the different uniforms for different occasions, the history of the regiment. Anything you want to know? Oh, very clever, Tom replied, crossing his arms. Study up on Wikipedia for a few hours and suddenly you're an expert, right? I've seen people memorize entire fake backstories just to pull cons like this. The pub felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in. The normal evening atmosphere had completely disappeared, replaced by something tense and uncomfortable. Mrs. Peterson had given up on her crossword entirely and was now openly staring at the confrontation. The young couple had pushed their plates away and were whispering to each other, probably debating whether they should leave. One of the construction workers cleared his throat. Tom, maybe you should just stay out of this, Bill. Tom cut him off sharply. He didn't need his regulars undermining his authority. I know how to handle my own pub. The soldier heard the exchange and seemed to take some hope from it. Thank you, he said to Bill, then turned back to Tom. Sir, I understand your caution, but I've been standing in the rain and cold for 12 hours straight. My feet are killing me. I haven't eaten since breakfast, and all I want is 1 pint before I head home to my flat. I'm not trying to con anyone or cause trouble. Tom studied the young man's face. The exhaustion was real. That much was obvious. The way he held himself, the slight tremor in his hands, the dark circles under his eyes. But lots of people were tired. That didn't make his story true. You know what I think? Tom said, leaning forward on the bar. I think you're one of those street performers who dress up like guards to pose for photos with tourists. Probably spent all day outside the palace gates taking pictures with visitors for tips. Now you're here trying to keep the act going, hoping to impress someone or get a free drink. The accusation hit like a physical blow. The soldier's face went pale, then flushed red with anger. For the first time since he'd walked in, his composure cracked completely. "A street performer?" he repeated, his voice rising. "You think I'm some kind of fake tourist attraction? Do you have any idea what it takes to become a Queen's Guard? The training, the dedication, the honor of wearing this uniform?" "Honor?" Tom laughed mockingly. "The only honor you've got is the nerve to walk into my pub dressed like that and expect me to believe your fairy tale." The soldier took a step closer to the bar, his hands shaking now with suppressed rage. "This uniform represents centuries of tradition. Men have died wearing these colors. They've protected kings and queens, served their country with pride, and you're calling it a costume?" "That's exactly what I'm calling it," Tom shot back, his own anger rising to match the stranger's. "A costume, a fake, a lie, just like everything else about you." The words hung in the air like a challenge. The entire pub was dead silent now, everyone holding their breath. Even the rain outside seemed to have quieted, as if the whole world was waiting to see what would happen next. The young soldier stood there for a long moment, his chest rising and falling as he fought to control his breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "I've given 5 years of my life to this country. 5 years of standing guard in all weather, protecting people who don't even know my name. I've missed birthdays, holidays, family gatherings, all in service to the crown. And you're telling me that means nothing?" Tom felt a small stab of uncertainty, but he pushed it down. He'd come too far to back down now. "What I'm telling you is to take your act somewhere else. This is a respectable establishment, and you're not welcome here." Danny Walker sat on his narrow bunk in the barracks, still feeling the sting of embarrassment from the night before. His uniform hung perfectly pressed in his locker, every button polished to a mirror shine, but he couldn't shake the memory of being treated like some kind of fraud. The other guys in his unit were getting ready for evening chow, their conversations echoing off the bare walls of Wellington Barracks. He'd been a Queen's Guard for 3 years now, and nothing like this had ever happened to him before. Sure, tourists sometimes asked if he was real when he was on duty, and kids occasionally tried to make him laugh or break his concentration, but that was different. That was part of the job. What happened at the King's Head was something else entirely. "You're quiet tonight, Walker," called out Pete Johnson from the next bunk over. Pete was one of the senior guards in their unit, a big guy from Yorkshire who'd been doing ceremonial duty for almost 7 years. "Everything all right?" Danny hesitated. Part of him wanted to just forget the whole thing, pretend it never happened. But it was eating at him, the way that pub owner had looked at him, like he was some kind of con artist or street performer. The laughter from the other customers, the complete dismissal of everything his uniform represented. "Had a bit of trouble last night," Danny finally said, sitting up on his bunk. "Stopped for a drink after duty and the pub owner threw me out. Said I was wearing a costume." The conversation in the room gradually died down as the other guardsmen started paying attention. There were 8 of them in this section of the barracks, and they'd all served together long enough to know each other's stories, each other's families, each other's struggles. "A costume?" Pete repeated, his eyebrows shooting up. "You mean he didn't believe you were a real guard?" "Didn't even want to look at my ID," Danny said, the frustration creeping back into his voice. "Called it fake before he even saw it. Said anyone could get fake military cards off the internet." Tommy Chen, the youngest member of their unit, stopped tying his boots and looked up. "That's mental. Why would anyone fake being one of us? It's not like we get special discounts or anything." "Where was this?" asked Rick Martinez, who was sitting at the small table they used for card games and letter writing. Rick had been in the Army for 12 years before joining the Queen's Guard, and he took their reputation seriously. "The King's Head, down on 9th Maple Street," Danny replied. "Just wanted a quiet pint after standing in the rain all day, instead got treated like some kind of criminal." The room went completely quiet. Danny could see the expressions changing on his mates' faces. What had started as casual interest was turning into something else. These men understood what it meant to wear the uniform, what it represented, what it cost them personally to serve. "He physically threw you out?" Pete asked, his voice getting harder. Danny nodded. Grabbed me by the arm and pushed me through the door, said he didn't serve costume parties and told me to find somewhere else to play dress-up. Bloody hell, muttered Jake Sullivan, who was polishing his boots by his locker. Jake was Irish with a quick temper and an even quicker sense of humor, but he wasn't smiling now. That's bang out of order, that is. The anger in the room was building like pressure in a kettle. These weren't just colleagues. They were brothers. They'd stood together through endless hours of ceremonial duty, through blazing summer heat and freezing winter cold. They'd supported each other through family problems, relationship troubles, and the unique challenges that came with their unusual job. "Did anyone get it on video?" asked Tommy, pulling out his phone. "This kind of thing usually ends up online these days." Danny's heart sank. He hadn't thought about that possibility. "I don't know. There were other people in the pub. Someone might have filmed it." Rick was already searching on his phone. "What did you say the place was called? The King's Head?" Within minutes, Rick found what they were all dreading. A shaky phone video clearly filmed by someone trying to be discreet, showing Danny being pushed out of the pub while still in his ceremonial uniform. The video quality wasn't great, but it was clear enough to see what was happening. "This has already got 300 views," Rick said grimly, showing the phone screen to the others. "Posted about 2 hours ago." The guardsmen gathered around to watch the video, seeing their mate being humiliated in uniform, being treated like a fraud when he'd just finished a 12-hour shift protecting the royal family, hit them all like a punch to the gut. "This is about more than just Danny now," Pete said quietly. "This is about all of us, about what this uniform means." Jake stood up from his boot polishing station, his face red with anger. "Some pub owner thinks he can treat one of us like dirt? Thinks our uniform is just fancy dress? Well, maybe it's time someone educated him about exactly who he threw out of his establishment." "Easy, Jake," Rick said, but there was steel in his own voice. "We need to think about this properly." Tommy was still staring at his phone screen, watching the video replay. "Look at the comments. People are taking sides. Some are defending Danny, saying the pub owner was out of line. But others are saying anyone can buy a uniform online, so how was the owner supposed to know?" "That's exactly the problem," Pete said, pacing now between the bunks. "People don't understand what this uniform represents anymore. They see it as just another costume, like something you'd hire for a fancy dress party." Danny felt worse with every passing minute. Not only had he been humiliated, but now his entire unit was being dragged into it. The video was spreading. People were talking about it, and the reputation of the Queen's Guard was being questioned by strangers on the internet. "I should have just walked away," he said miserably. "Should have gone to a different pub." "No," Rick said firmly. "You did nothing wrong. You finished your duty, you were tired and wet, and you wanted a drink like any other citizen. The fact that you were still in uniform shouldn't have mattered. If anything, it should have earned you respect, not suspicion." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant Major Harrison, a veteran of 23 years who commanded respect just by walking into a room. The guardsmen automatically straightened up, but Harrison waved them at ease. "I've heard about what happened last night," he said without preamble, looking directly at Danny. "Word travels fast in this place, and that video is already making the rounds through the regiment." Danny felt his stomach drop. "Sir, I didn't mean for this to become a big issue." "You didn't do anything wrong, Walker," Harrison cut him off. "But this has become bigger than just one incident at one pub. This is about public perception of the Queen's Guard, about the respect our uniform commands, about the dignity of our service." The sergeant major paused, looking around at all the men in the room. "Now, I can't officially tell you what to do about this situation, but I will say that the honor of the regiment is something we all share. When one of us is disrespected, we're all disrespected." He didn't say anything else, but the message was clear. Harrison turned and left the room, leaving the guardsman to contemplate his words. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Pete spoke up. "Right then, I think we all know what needs to happen here. The pub owner needs to understand exactly who he threw out," Jake added, his earlier anger now focused into determination. "And the best way to show him is to introduce ourselves properly," Rick said with a grim smile. Tommy looked nervous. Are we talking about causing trouble? Because I don't think— Not trouble, Pete interrupted. Education. We're going to pay a visit to the King's Head in uniform and have a proper conversation with the owner about what this uniform represents. Danny felt a mix of gratitude and worry. He was touched that his mates were willing to stand up for him, but he didn't want them getting in trouble because of his bad experience. You don't have to do this, he said. It's my problem, not yours. That's where you're wrong, mate, Jake said, clapping him on the shoulder. When someone disrespects one of us, they disrespect all of us. We're not just individuals wearing the same uniform. We're part of something bigger, something that's been going for centuries. Rick nodded in agreement. Besides, that pub owner made it clear he doesn't know what a real Queen's Guard looks like. Well, tomorrow he's going to get a proper education. We'll show him what 12 real guards look like when they walk into his establishment together. It was exactly 3:15 in the afternoon when Tom first noticed something unusual happening on Maple Street. He was restocking the beer cooler behind the bar, getting ready for what he expected to be another normal Friday evening rush. The lunch crowd had cleared out about an hour ago, leaving just a handful of regulars scattered around the pub. Old Harry was in his usual spot by the window, reading his newspaper and nursing a half pint that he'd been working on for the better part of an hour. 2 office workers were sharing a late lunch at a corner table, their laptops open as they tried to catch up on work. The atmosphere was relaxed, peaceful even. That's when Tom heard the sound. At first, he thought it might be construction work, or maybe a delivery truck backing up somewhere down the street. But as the sound got clearer, he realized it was something else entirely. Footsteps, lots of them, all moving in perfect rhythm, like they were keeping time to some unheard music. Tom straightened up from the cooler and walked toward the front window. What he saw made his blood run cold. Coming down Maple Street in perfect formation were 12 men in the exact same red uniform he'd seen the night before. They marched in 2 straight lines, their movements so precise they looked like they'd been choreographed. Every step hit the pavement at exactly the same moment, creating that rhythmic sound that had caught his attention. The uniforms were identical to the one worn by the young man he'd thrown out. Bright red jackets with gold buttons that caught the afternoon sunlight, white belts across their chests, and those massive black fur hats that made them look even taller than they already were. But seeing 12 of them together was completely different from seeing just one wet, tired soldier standing at his bar. Bloody hell, Tom whispered under his breath. The formation was led by an older man who carried himself with obvious authority. Even from a distance, Tom could see the extra stripes on his uniform that marked him as someone important. The other 11 followed behind him in perfect order, their faces serious and focused straight ahead. Other people on the street had stopped to stare. A woman pushing a pram stood frozen on the sidewalk, her mouth slightly open as she watched the unusual parade. A group of teenagers came out of the fish and chip shop, phones already in their hands to record what was happening. Even the traffic seemed to slow down as drivers craned their necks to see what was going on. Inside the pub, the atmosphere changed completely. Old Harry looked up from his newspaper, his reading glasses sliding down his nose as he tried to focus on what was happening outside. The office workers had abandoned their laptops entirely and were now pressed against the window, trying to get a better view. "Tom," one of them called out, his voice tight with nervousness. "I think they're coming here." Tom's hands started to shake slightly as the full reality of the situation hit him. These weren't actors or street performers or people in costumes. The precision of their march, the identical uniforms, the sheer presence they commanded. This was the real thing. These were actual Queen's Guards, and they were heading straight for his pub. The formation came to a halt directly in front of the King's Head. Tom could see them clearly now through the window. 12 men who looked like they'd stepped out of a royal ceremony. Their uniforms were immaculate, not a single button out of place or a wrinkle in their jackets. The fur hats added at least 6 inches to their height, making them look imposing and official. The leader, who Tom could now see was definitely an officer of some kind, gave a quiet command that Tom couldn't hear through the glass. As one unit, all 12 guards turned to face the pub's front door. Then they began moving forward. The pub door opened with its familiar jingle, but the sound seemed different now, more ominous. The first guard through the door had to duck slightly because of his hat, and as he straightened up, he seemed to fill the entire doorway. The others followed behind him, filing into the pub in the same perfect order they'd maintained on the street. Tom had seen some unusual things in his 16 years of running the pub, but nothing like this. The guards didn't spread out or look around curiously like normal customers would. Instead, they arranged themselves in a semicircle facing the bar, with their leader standing slightly in front of the others. The silence in the pub was absolute. Old Harry had set down his newspaper and was staring openly, his half-pint forgotten on the table. The office workers looked like they were holding their breath. Even the usual background noise from the kitchen had stopped. Tom's cook had obviously heard the commotion and come out to see what was happening. Tom found himself face to face with the officer, a man who appeared to be in his 40s with sharp eyes and the kind of bearing that spoke of years of military service. His uniform had more decorations than the others, and the way the younger guards positioned themselves showed clearly that he was in charge. "Good afternoon," the officer said, his voice carrying easily through the quiet pub. It wasn't loud, but there was an authority to it that made everyone listen. "I'm Captain Williams of the Queen's Guard. I believe you met one of my men last evening." Tom's mouth went dry. He tried to speak but found that his voice had disappeared entirely. All he could do was nod slightly, acknowledging what they both knew to be true. Captain Williams continued, his tone remaining calm and professional. "Guardsman Walker informed us that he visited your establishment last night after completing a 12-hour ceremonial duty shift. He was, according to his account, refused service and physically removed from the premises." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Tom could feel the eyes of everyone in the pub on him, his regular customers, his staff, and most intimidatingly, the 12 uniformed men who represented something much bigger than just themselves. I thought," Tom started, then stopped. How could he explain his reasoning now? How could he justify what he'd done when faced with the obvious proof that he'd been completely wrong? "You thought what exactly?" Captain Williams asked, and while his voice remained level, there was steel underneath it. "You thought that one of Her Majesty's guards was playing dress-up? You thought that a man who had just spent 12 hours protecting the royal family was somehow trying to deceive you?" Tom looked around desperately, hoping for some kind of support or understanding from his customers, but found none. Old Harry was shaking his head slowly, clearly disappointed. The office workers were looking at him like he'd committed some terrible crime. His own cook was standing in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed, waiting to see how Tom would handle this situation. The uniform looked, Tom began weakly, then realized how ridiculous that sounded now that he was facing 12 identical uniforms, all clearly authentic, all worn by men who obviously belonged in them. "The uniform looked like what?" Captain Williams pressed. "Like something from a costume shop? Like fancy dress?" One of the younger guards, and Tom suddenly realized it was probably the same young man from the night before, though it was hard to tell with the formal hat and the serious expression, took a small step forward. "Permission to speak, sir?" he said to the captain. "Granted, Walker." So it was him, the same tired, wet soldier who had just wanted a drink after a long day of service. But now, surrounded by his unit and wearing his uniform with obvious pride, he looked completely different. Confident, professional, unmistakably genuine. "Sir, I tried to show the gentleman my identification," Walker said, looking directly at Tom. "I offered to answer any questions about our service, our duties, our history. I explained that I had been on ceremonial guard duty at Buckingham Palace, but he wasn't interested in listening to any of it." Tom felt heat rising in his cheeks. Hearing it laid out like this in front of witnesses made his actions from the night before sound even worse than they had seemed at the time. Captain Williams nodded slowly. "And what was his response to your attempts to verify your identity?" "He said anyone could fake military identification. He accused me of being a street performer who poses with tourists for tips. He called our uniform a costume and suggested I was trying to con him out of free drinks." The silence that followed was deafening. Tom could hear the clock on the wall ticking, could hear traffic passing outside, could even hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. But inside the pub, nobody moved or spoke. Finally, Captain Williams broke the silence. "Mr. Bradley," Tom managed to croak out. "Tom Bradley. Mr. Bradley, do you understand what this uniform represents?" Tom stared at Captain Williams, the question hanging in the air like a weight on his chest. What did the uniform represent? 24 hours ago, he would have answered with sarcasm or dismissal. Now, surrounded by 12 men who wore it with obvious pride and dignity, he was beginning to understand just how badly he'd messed up. Tom started, then stopped. His throat felt dry, and the words wouldn't come. The truth was, he didn't really know what the uniform represented. He'd seen guards at Buckingham Palace during tourist visits, sure, but he'd never really thought about what they actually did, or what it meant to wear those red jackets. Captain Williams waited patiently, not rushing him or showing any signs of impatience. The other guards stood perfectly still, their discipline obvious in every line of their posture. Even old Harry had stopped pretending to read his newspaper and was listening to every word. "I don't know," Tom finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, I know you guard the Queen, but I never really thought about what that actually means." The captain nodded slowly as if this was exactly the answer he'd expected. "Mr. Bradley, this uniform has been worn continuously for over 350 years. Men have died wearing these colors, protecting not just the royal family, but the very idea of what Britain represents." He gestured slightly toward the guard standing behind him. "These men wake up every morning and put on this uniform, knowing that they're part of something bigger than themselves. They stand for hours in all weather. Blazing heat, freezing cold, pouring rain. They maintain their positions while tourists try to make them laugh, while people take pictures while the world goes on around them." Tom found himself really listening for the first time. The captain's voice was calm and measured, but there was passion underneath it. This wasn't just a job to these men. It was a calling. "Guardsman Walker here," the captain continued, indicating. "Danny has been doing this for 3 years. Yesterday, he stood at his post from 6 in the morning until 6 at night. 12 hours without sitting down, without checking his phone, without even moving unless it was part of his official duties. He did this in the rain, watching people live their normal lives while he protected something sacred." Danny remained at attention, but Tom could see something in his eyes now. Not anger, exactly, but hurt. The kind of hurt that comes from having your deepest values questioned and dismissed. When his shift ended, Captain Williams went on, he didn't immediately change out of his uniform because he was exhausted and just wanted to get somewhere warm and dry. He came to your pub as a customer, asking for nothing more than what any other citizen would expect, basic service and respect. The weight of guilt was settling on Tom's shoulders like a heavy blanket. He was starting to understand that this wasn't just about one incident or one misunderstanding. This was about how he'd treated someone who had spent his entire day serving others. "Instead of respect," the captain said, his voice getting slightly harder, "he was accused of being a fraud. His service was dismissed as play acting. His uniform, which represents centuries of tradition and sacrifice, was called a costume." Tom looked around the pub at his customers. Mrs. Chen from the corner shop had come in during the confrontation and was standing near the door, obviously afraid to interrupt but too curious to leave. The office workers were still frozen at their table, their lunch completely forgotten. Everyone was watching him, waiting to see what he would do. "I was wrong," Tom said suddenly, the words coming out louder than he'd intended. "I was completely wrong, and I'm sorry." But Captain Williams wasn't finished. "Mr. Bradley, do you know what happens when someone disrespects one of my men?" Tom shook his head, not trusting his voice. "They disrespect all of us," the captain explained. "Because we're not just individuals who happen to wear the same uniform. We're brothers. We stand together, we serve together, and when one of us is treated badly, we all feel it." The enormity of what Tom had done was finally sinking in. He hadn't just insulted one tired soldier. He'd insulted an entire regiment, a tradition, a way of life that went back centuries. "Sir," Danny spoke up again, "may I say something?" Captain Williams nodded. Danny looked directly at Tom, and his expression was serious but not unkind. Mr. Bradley, I understand why you were suspicious. People do fake things these days, and you were trying to protect your business. But the thing is, this uniform isn't just clothing to us, it's our identity. It's who we are. Tom found himself nodding, finally beginning to grasp what Danny was trying to tell him. When I put on this uniform, Danny continued, I'm not just Danny Walker anymore. I'm part of something that's been protecting this country since before your pub existed, since before this street existed. I'm connected to every man who's ever worn these colors, every guard who's ever stood watch, every soldier who's ever put duty before comfort. The passion in the young man's voice was unmistakable. This wasn't rehearsed or formal. This was coming straight from his heart. And when you called it a costume, Danny said, his voice getting stronger, you weren't just insulting me. You were insulting every man who's ever served, every family who's lost someone in service, every person who's ever found comfort in knowing that someone was standing guard. Tom felt tears starting to form in his eyes. He'd run this pub for 16 years, priding himself on treating people fairly and with respect. But last night, he'd failed completely. He'd let his assumptions and prejudices override his basic decency. I'm sorry, he said, and this time he meant it with every fiber of his being. Danny, Guardsman Walker, I owe you an apology, a real one. I judged you without listening. I dismissed your service without understanding it, and I treated you badly, when you deserved respect. Danny's expression softened slightly, but he maintained his military bearing. Tom turned to address all the guards. I owe all of you an apology. I insulted something that you've dedicated your lives to, something that means everything to you. I was ignorant and stubborn and wrong. Captain Williams studied Tom's face carefully, as if trying to determine whether the apology was genuine. After a long moment, he seemed satisfied with what he saw. Mr. Bradley, the captain said, ignorance can be corrected with education. What matters now is whether you're willing to learn. Yes, Tom said immediately. Yes, I want to learn. I want to understand. The captain smiled for the first time since entering the pub. Then perhaps you'd be interested in witnessing a changing of the guard ceremony. See for yourself what these men do, how they serve, what their dedication looks like in practice. Tom nodded eagerly. I would be honored. And perhaps, the captain added, you might consider making your establishment a place where military personnel know they're welcome, a place where service is recognized and respected. Absolutely, Tom said. In fact, he paused, an idea forming. Would it be appropriate if I put up a photo? Something to show that the King's Head respects and honors military service? Captain Williams looked at his men, and Tom could see small smiles appearing on several faces. I think that would be very appropriate, the captain said. Danny stepped forward slightly. Mr. Bradley, would it be all right if I had that drink now? I'm off duty today. Tom felt a huge wave of relief wash over him. Of course. Please, all of you, drinks are on the house. It's the least I can do. As the tension in the room finally began to ease, Tom realized that something important had happened here. He'd learned a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. More than that, he'd been given a chance to make things right. The guards began to relax their formal posture, and the normal sounds of the pub slowly returned. But Tom knew that nothing would ever be quite the same. He had a new understanding of service, of sacrifice, and of the importance of listening before judging. From that day forward, the King's Head became known as a place where military personnel were always welcome, where service was honored, and where one man's mistake had become everyone's lesson about respect and understanding.